Have you ever wondered what it meant to speak with other men and be a father that had effective communication? Well, today we're going to talk with Scott about that. And I'm really excited to be here with Scott. He is a man that is true to his word. He's always been super kind to me, super helpful in every single way. We met through Apex. We're in that mastermind, and we're also in a syndicate together. And we really just get along very well. Every time we talk, we're like, hey, we're going to talk about business. And it always turns into this whole conversation about life and all these other things. And we finally get around to business. But I promise today we are going to actually talk about these things and not just talk about some random stuff. But Scott is, he's got a VA business. He's got the fatherhood or brotherhood, which is what we're really going to focus on here. He's got a couple podcast stories that sell and just all around great guy. But Scott, you're married, got kids. He's got everything here. This is a man that I definitely look up to. But Scott, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for that amazing introduction. I have some big shoes to fill with that. Yeah, brother, I'm pumped to be here and so excited that, especially about what we're going to talk about. I mean, I'm just really excited about like what you're doing, and I've been watching you obviously since I first met you months and months ago. Man, I don't know how long it's been, but it's been an exciting ride. So first of all, I just thank you very much.
Yeah, well, of course, man. I had to get you on. I know you've already had me on your podcast. I was like, it's about time to get you on. And just the way you go about everything just really impresses me. You always go above and beyond. Even when I was talking to you, you had one sign on behind you. And I was like, hey, we're going to really focus on this business that you have, not one of the other 20 businesses that you have. And you're like, hold on a second. I got to change out the sign. And
That's
that's
right.
just how Scott is. He's very particular. He's got everything in place and he's ready to go. Definitely a seasoned entrepreneur and dad, Christian, and
Mm-hmm.
everything. And so I'm really excited to get into this. But Scott, let me go ahead and start with the first question I like to ask. And how did you get over that fear of public speaking?
I still have it.
All right.
I think, 300 or 400 podcast episodes helps a lot. But quite frankly, I have a master's degree in education.
Mm,
And with that, you get in front of an audience of 15 to 30 every single day for years on end. I did public education for 13 years to middle schoolers. And I'll tell you what, if you bumble in front of middle schoolers, you're never going to end hearing about it. And
yeah.
so a lot of repetition. And, it's interesting when I get in front of a group, and I've presented in front of a couple hundred, never a large crowd. And I I just have this ability to kind of go into a flow state. And
Mm,
that's really what I depend on. And I don't think that's a super effective, but it's worked for me really well. And I get really focused and when I enjoy the conversation or I enjoy the topic, it just really seriously comes from the heart
mhm.
and just the reps, quite frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can tell that you are very genuine. And I think that's where that flow state really comes in. And we've had some offline conversations and just about different things. And you're just like, hey, God spoke to me, and this is just what I feel like I need to do. And I can definitely see that you would do that whenever you're having any of these events or these speeches that you're doing for sure.
I think last summer, actually, no, last September, I had my first men's event. I've done multiple events, multiple activities, like overnight event type things. This one was my first men's one that kind of branched off the Brotherhood of Fatherhood, which has been a podcast in place for 3 years. And I had an idea of what I was going to talk to on say on the opening speech, or I don't know what you would call it. We called it a fireside chat because it was around a big bonfire. It was
Mhm.
awesome with a bunch of men. I
So
had an
literal
idea.
fireside chat. I love
Yes,
it.
it literally was. So here I am. All these guys are coming in from all over the United States, Canada. They're flying in. We're picking them up. And I'm sitting there at this property we're at, and I'm in the bedroom, and I'm like, boom, this idea comes in my head. And this is what
Mhm.
happens. It's very unique. It's very interesting. It's anti what speaking coaches would tell me. So I really need to dig into this speaking coach thing. But really for me, it hit me immediately. I got out a 3x5 note card and I started taking frantic notes. And this is the way my brain works.
Mm.
And made notes like bullet points. And that night, I just had that thing in my hand. And before the end of it, it was the intro. It was setting the pace for the entire week that we had ahead of us. And I know I nailed it out of the park because when I was done, I asked each man to share why he was there and what he hoped to get out of it. And there were tears and crazy things happening, like major breakthrough. And I basically came up with the 3 pillars of what I wanted the week to represent. And I shared personal, heartfelt stories in front of them, showed real emotion, and I was just raw and honest. And that set the stage for what was going on. And that's really, again, probably against what you would say to do. It's really how I've focused anytime where I've had something that's been kind of a major like breakthrough presentation or talk, is when it's incredibly heartfelt. And for me, I have a belief that maybe that's a little more supernatural than it is, me. And I just have to believe that because I don't know where it's coming from. Usually it's just usually this place where all of a sudden something wells up in my heart, my brain just pops with ideas, and I'll take frantic notes and then I'll just go and do what I do. It's a real interesting process.
Yeah, yeah, and would say I'm not the typical speaking coach because I don't have a degree in communications or anything like that. And even though I have a degree in electrical engineering, so I'm highly educated in quotes there. But
Yes,
the thing is, and that's a detail oriented thing too. I'm not super detail oriented. So my thing is more about getting you that confidence and clarity of what your message will be more than, hey, we want to make sure we have this structure. Now there's type
mm-hmm.
A people that I coach and work with, and we have to have that structure for them. But for the most part, I really just fall back on my speaking bars method, which is really begin with that end in mind. What do you want that audience to know? And then who is that audience? And that having that audience awareness and understanding, remembering it's not about you, and then serving them with all of that. And that's what you really did with that, even if it was a 5-minute prep time. I do
Oh yeah,
suggest trying to have a more of a game plan than that, but sometimes it comes to you and you just have to roll with that. And I think that's a great way to do it. And that's really how you evoke those emotions and actually create the transformation versus having an amazing speech. And there are speakers that get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars and they practice the same speech over and over and
yes,
over again. And it's a great speech, don't get me wrong, but it's not super passionate, and they can
right.
make themselves where it seems passionate, but to me at that point it becomes disingenuous. And so for myself personally, like while I want to get on some bigger stages, I don't necessarily want to have that super polished and practiced speech like that. I want to be able to
I agree.
give that value to everybody. So I would say I'm a little bit against the grain when it comes to most
I
of the
love that.
speaking coaches like that, for
I love
sure. But
that.
just yeah, having the tactics and the strategy of where you're trying to go with that, I think is the thing. And you mentioned that right at the beginning. Like you were trying to set the precedence for the whole event with that intro speech right there, which is so important.
Just did that the same thing. We had it, and I with a couple other guys I knew threw together another event. It was up in British Columbia in April. April, yeah. No, March. Sorry, we're in April, and we had 20 guys there. And my role was to talk. I had two different ones. I had morning routine and my value ladder, which is something I love talking about. And then the other one was marriage. And
Mm,
for me, I had my 4 main points. And I had those a long time ago. Those are what I kind of roll with. How
mhm.
they come out really depends on the audience.
Yeah.
And so, some interaction. Also, one thing I do is when I have an opportunity, especially with a small group like that, I really pay attention. I watch, I'm observing, I'm looking at like the way that they're talking about their families. And I'm looking for points where I know that will actually hit. But the thing is I am really practiced because these are things I talk about on the podcast over and over and over again. Whenever I'm a guest, whenever I'm running my podcast and talking to men who are in these situations or walking through being a parent or walking through being a husband and how that looks. So for me, I guess they are really practiced. And that's what I love about podcasting is the fact that you are doing just reps, so many reps talking about things that you're going to get better as you go along.
I couldn't agree more. I think podcasting is really an undervalued asset to have, especially when it comes to your speaking and learning how to create your message, because it really goes on both sides. It helps you be able to learn to speak where you can go share that message on a stage or in a meeting room or something like that. But then it also helps you with everyday conversation because we're just going back and forth here. There's no script and we're just smoothly going back and forth here. And it's really just a volley, it's a conversation, and that podcast allows you to learn how to have that conversation and almost small talk, but really that next level up where you're getting a little deeper into a conversation. And that's another area besides the speaking that I see people struggle with. People struggle so much with just having small talk, having that conversation. We talked about this just here offline. You see so many people in the DMs that would just go, they have like one thing they'll ask you about, like, oh, yeah, I see you're a girl dad. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I'm a girl dad too. Hey, by the way, I see you're a coach. You want to be in my group coaching? I'm like, really? Did we really just go there in two questions? Like, this is
Hmm.
crazy. But people don't know how to have that small talk and build that rapport and relationship first.
Yeah. Relationships are incredibly important, especially just there's so much value in laying a groundwork. And I've learned that instead of having an end in mind, sure, I have an end in mind. I'd love to sell somebody my services. Like, I would be crazy to say anything different. But I remember talking to a mutual guy that we know, Kevin, and he's
Mhm.
like, hey, if you just listen for what the problem is, if you have a solution, just flat out say it. But you got to listen. And I started to kind of take that to heart. And then I realized that if I just laid down my expectations for an outcome
Mhm.
and just came to serve, then everything really worked itself out. And I was just listening to a podcast on Real AF with um, it was with Alex Hermosi, and they had a
Yeah.
two-part series. And at the end of part one and into the part two, they're talking about just giving and the
Mm.
the actual formula and how that works. And I have found that to be true. And I think that's something, if you're going to drop into someone's DMs, like just have conversation with them until you've actually given them more value than they would ever expect. Then I think it's okay over time to ask.
Mhm.
And I think you'd have so much better results taking the time to do it right.
Yeah, and actually did something similar to that. There was a guy that we had seen each other, so we hadn't really talked a lot, but we'd seen each other through Arate and Apex and everything, these different masterminds. And he had posted a speech he had done. And I just decided, like, hey, I'm just gonna randomly shoot him a DM and just say, like, hey, great job on the speech. Here's a thing or two that you can work on. And I'll say, he's like, dude, thank you so much. He's like, let's get on a call. And now it's still kind of the follow up phase with him.
Mm-hmm.
But he was wanted to get on a call and actually talk. And I was able to have a sales conversation simply because I decided to actually give him some feedback on his speech. And he really appreciated that. And again, we had a little bit of rapport, not a ton, but sometimes it doesn't happen like that, but you have to give, and that was interesting with Alex how he mentioned that. So those of you
Yeah,
that haven't watched it, definitely go back and watch that. But he mentioned as well that you can pay into ads and you get so many return leads on that and things of that nature. You can put out a piece of content and you get so many impressions. But what really compounds and it's not linear is having that word of mouth, and by giving back so much, people try and reciprocate that and everything. And I'm really summarizing that, but essentially, the more you give, the more exponential growth you will have in the long run.
it's
Yeah,
so
incredible
true.
episode.
Yeah. And I was telling you, and this is not a flex, I was telling you today, I think I've gotten 12 organic leads today through referrals.
Mm,
And that's a result of changing my mindset. Instead of being like really stressed and trying to work really hard for the leads, now I try really hard to serve, and it's really worked well. If Alex's formula and the way he broke it down was incredible, and I encourage people to listen to that if you don't mind the language, but it was a
yeah.
really good episode on really what you can do to thrive as an entrepreneur and business owner.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so definitely go check that out. Now let's make a little transition here over to our men. You
Mm.
went going back to your retreat that you did. You go in and you're having these emotional conversations and everything. And we see in today's age where you can't have emotions, but you're supposed to show emotions, but just all this craziness. So, explain to us a little bit about how men can perhaps share those emotions and still be a quote unquote man, a manly man.
There's quite honestly, being a really good communicator with your wife and your boys and other men who are in your circle is really how you serve as a man. That is
Mm,
really how you can help get to a bigger, more open space where you can learn, and actually there's nothing unmasculine about it. In fact, I would say that vulnerability takes more masculinity than wearing a social armor. And one way that my friend Brian talked about it, because he was at my event, he's like, we all came here with our social armor, and that social armor, we put this armor on. Just think of a knight, right? And you
mhm,
walk in and it's buffed out and it's shiny and it's perfect and everything looks amazing. He said, but what happened at this event was we all just threw our social armor to the side and we were wearing our real armor. And when you get up close and personal with another man, you see that it's absolutely scratched to crap. It's got holes, it's got puncture, there's blood all over it. It's just destroyed because we have gone through a lot as men, but
mhm.
we put on this facade that everything is really great. And so I would argue that actually the most masculine thing you can do is be vulnerable. You are putting yourself in a place, you're at risk. And risk is, attacking risk, facing that storm, walking into that storm takes guts, and it takes real manliness, I guess is what I would say. But I think that that is one of the most masculine things you can do. And here's the deal with that is if you can get that way with your brothers, if you can get that way with other men who are going in the same direction as you or are at where you want to go, and those are the men that you should be circling yourself with. That's why I do events. I want to pull a bunch of men together who all are going on the same trajectory. They all want to be better husbands. They want to be better fathers. They want to be better community leaders. They want to be better business leaders or employees or employers. Those are the people I intentionally put myself around. I want to be with guys that have the same idea in mind and know that the only way to get there is to continually look at themselves, evaluate, and move forward. So I would say that you have to set a precedence when in the midst of other men that you are an open book and you're doing it not only to help them feel comfortable, but also to grow yourself. Because how do you grow without a mirror being put up in front of you? And the best way to put up a mirror in front of you is to get with other people who care enough to tell you the truth and don't just tell you the shiny, the distorted mirror look that you think you want to see. And that's where I think real growth comes from. For me as a man in my marriage, it'll be 27 years this year. The absolute most manly thing I can do to my wife, for my wife, that could go bad really fast, do for my wife is be fit, be serving God, and serve my family. So be fit. Like you've gotta do the best you can do with your body. You have to
Mhm.
spend the time being prepared so that you can provide, protect over your family. And then
Now we're talking about like six pack fit, or are we just talking about like being in
everybody's
decent shape?
everybody's different. and
Okay.
and it's called just doing the best you can do. And I talked to a guy the other day and he's like, show me your calendar, I'll show you space to work out. I'll show you time. It's all about priorities and values.
Mm.
And I talk a lot about values. Fitness is not top that by any means, but it's incredibly important. But one of the things I know about women, because I've been married for so many years, and my wife and I work with married couples, and we do this work and help others do better in their marriage, is that your you being emotionally available is one of the most masculine and supportive things you can do for them, because they speak in emotional intimacy terms. That's an
Mm.
intimacy that they like, the level that most women operate on. And that is really masculine. It's not being a blubbering idiot. It's talking about the things that really matter. So I would challenge that whole premise that, being masculine is shoving your feelings down inside. Now, I think there's a time and a place for stoicism, and there's a time and a place for looking at things pragmatically. There is always a time for that, especially when you're leading your family through trouble or stress. But
Mhm.
on the other flip side of that, communicating with them, and this is something that you and I probably agree on a lot, is I talk to men over and over again about being an over communicator to your family, because what you think is over communicating is hitting the needs of probably your wife and your kids. And there's multiple ways I do that. And I really think that it's led to where my boys are now at 15 and 18, where they are very well functioning, very independent, critical thinkers who have big dreams and are pushing the envelope in what they're supposed to be doing at their age. And that has everything to do with communication in the family.
Mm. So if I want to go back real quick, kind of to that emotion thing, as I can definitely see where, yes, there are those emotions that we need to connect with, especially for our wife, and then of course our kids, especially if we got girls, they're definitely going to be emotional.
Yes.
I'm not there yet. She just kind of screams when she doesn't get food or something like that. And she's only 17 months old, but for those that maybe, their wife, they want to share these emotions, or they want to be able to be there for them emotionally, but perhaps their wife, when they start to get a little, we'll call it vulnerable, they start to get a little emotional and share how they're feeling, and sometimes those feelings aren't I'm mad or I'm happy, they're, that hurt my feelings, like what you said there, or this thing that happened at work, maybe that hurt my feelings, and I feel disrespected, or whatever that feeling may be, but it's a feeling, almost of a sad feeling. It's a
Mm-hmm.
sad emotion. And then the wife kind of reacts that, "Oh, why are you being a woman?" And what would you
Yeah.
say to that?
Well, I would say you haven't done some groundwork first, because we do have to be strong and we have to lead through, how we respond to things. And I think there's a very appropriate time to be honest, but you have to develop that relationship as well. And
Mm,
for me, it really comes down to something I learned in a course that my wife and I teach is, for you men and women, if you were to be in let's say you're on a beach and it's the wet sand on the beach, so it's kind of compacted, and you have a
mm,
long stick and you're holding it in front of you, and you stick it into the ground, and you just turn a super tight circle. When you're done, you're going to have this really tight circle drawn around you, around your feet. And
mm,
before you start sharing and telling everything that's going wrong, the first thing that you have to do in your life is understand that the only thing you can control is inside of that circle. The only thing that you can really control in life is what's inside that circle. And all accountability lands inside of that circle. So when things happen to you, instead of like, hey, this really hurts my feelings, that comes off as victimhood, as you're in a victim and you're weak, unless you say, hey, over time, you have communicated that ultimately where I'm at right now and the way I feel is my own fault. And this is, I think, where men really go wrong a lot, and women
mm,
too. Like, hey, babe, this really hurt my feelings, but here's the truth. I haven't been super honest with you in the past. So this is really on me. But I think it's time to share with you that I have been quiet. I haven't shared how I felt. And this has been happening for a while. And I'm not asking you to change. I just want you to know how I feel. So, one, it's all my fault. I am to the belief that if someone runs a red light and T-bones you, there's still something you did that got you to that moment that you are ultimately responsible. Like this is Jocko Willick, right? Like
mm,
extreme ownership. I think you need to take that into your marriage and be outwardly communicating that for months, years, to develop a trust in which when you come and say, I'm really hurt about this, you are not coming to the table as a victim. You're
mm,
coming to the table as a human being. And I
mm.
think that's setting a foundation in the marriage or in the relationship where she knows that you're not blaming anybody.
Yeah.
This is just either communicating like, hey, this is how I feel in this situation. I understand that I have a major part in this, and this is how I come to my wife.
Hmm.
I realize I'm totally at fault at this, but now we're here and this is how I feel. And I think it's just a reframing, but also doing the work ahead of time in your family, in your with your wife, with your kids, of that extreme ownership. You're modeling it for one, and do it relentlessly. And then when you come with situations, they're much more well received because they understand that you're not placing blame.
Mm. I mean, that is so true. And I can attest to that because that's actually happened for my marriage. There was some conversations going on, and I was kind of like, hey, that doesn't make me feel good. And then it was just kind of like, oh, why are you being such a woman? And then I got thinking about it later. I'm like, well, how can I go about this different? What is something that I can really work on for myself? And it was really taking that ownership perspective and just saying, like, hey, and I just straight up said, like, hey, I'm not blaming you, because I think that's where that kind of came from, was you're blaming me for how you're feeling. It's my fault that you feel that way. And that's what you're telling me. And it's like, no, yes and no. Like, yes, because you are doing the action, but it's back on me because I allowed that action to control me in my emotional state, which is the thing that you were getting at. And so when I came back and said that, if I was just like, look, I didn't set this boundary here to not allow that to happen. If that happens, I should have set the boundary and said, no, we're not doing that. Just like I wouldn't sit here and cuss you out and tell you how bad your cooking is or something as an example. That's how men should treat women, or tell women rather, that, hey, this is a boundary. You've stepped over the line here. That I'm going to set this line here again and remind you that you can't step over this line. But as they do it, and then you come and say, that's my fault for allowing you to step over it, but I'm drawing this line here so you know where that boundary is now. And that's that communication that you
It
have
is.
right there. And
It
it's
is.
a hard thing, especially early in marriage. It took me like 3 years. So I guess it's not that long into marriage, but finally just think about it. I'm like, you know what? This really does come back to me, and it's my fault because I'm allowing her. Or you could put your manager or your customer, whoever this may be, in that same situation. If you're allowing them to change your emotional state, that's on you at the end of the day, because
Absolutely.
they're not thinking about you at all. They're just saying whatever they want to say. They may be trying to ruffle your feathers, but that's on you to allow those feathers to get ruffled or you to get emotional. So you draw that boundary, and if they do cross it, you tell them, "Hey, you cross this boundary. This is not cool to do." But still have that emotion, like even keel emotion.
Absolutely. My wife and I had this point, I don't know if it's 10 or 12, 15 years ago, where I finally said something to her. I'm like, I figured it out. We were reading a book and I figured it out. I'm like, when you do that, I feel disrespected and I respond this way. And
Mm,
having that conversation, coming to the table, and how I have deep conversations with my wife where it might get a little spicy, is like, hey, I've got something I need to share with you. We're going to need to go deep. It's really strong on my heart. When's a good
mm,
time for that? And
mm,
so, and we set that aside. And then when I come at it, I know two things are going to happen. One, she's immediately going to be on edge or at defense if I don't approach this right, which is 99.9% of the time. And two, I'll need to carve out more time. But more importantly, I need to fall on the sword early
mm,
to de-arm the situation. So for her, I'm like, hey, over the years, I've let this bother me, and it's become more and more and more prevalent. You say, when I make a decision, you're questioning it. And I don't
mm,
think you're questioning whether my decision making is good, but what that makes me feel is disrespected and like you don't appreciate my leadership.
mm,
And I remember this conversation, like, whoa, like that's not it at all. And we kind of got back to it, and it was a parental thing, how she was raised. You always questioned everything. And I'm like that makes me feel really, really like small
yeah.
and disrespected. And that communication, and I fell on the sword. I have not communicated this. I let it make me get angry. I let it control my emotions, and it's caused a lot of grief over the last few years. And I want to change that. And
Mm,
so now we get to the point where I can literally look at her and say, that really made me feel disrespected. And it's boom. And she'll do the same thing on the terms that, because we developed this relationship where when we have these things and we see this pattern, we're like, oh, wait a minute, I've screwed up over time. Now we're in this predicament where we're not talking at the same level and we're starting to encroach on disrespect for each other. Now we've established what that communication looks like and the protocol, which is I'm not attacking you. I'm coming in to you, with you, showing you my heart. This really like wells up anger or frustration or sadness. And I take responsibility for letting it go this long and not sharing with you early on that this is what I should have done. And then what can I do to help you for us not to get in this position? So again, like maybe it's her doing it, but what can I do to help to avoid this coming up again? So again, getting it, what's in my circle that I can control, because you can't, once you try to control other people, you've given up full control of everything.
Yeah, it's like trying to herd cats at that point. It's just not going to work out at all.
Exactly.
So let's move forward a little bit here. You mentioned about over communicating. I've got a little funny story that I've shared a few times about how we had this ant infestation, and I was telling my wife about, oh my gosh, there was ants in the dog food. And now we have the dog food bowl, which is out there in the den, and then we have the dog food container. And so clearly I said dog food. So that could have been two locations. And she comes back and is like, oh my gosh, there's ants by the dog food in the laundry room. And I'm like, that's what I said. But I didn't actually say that. And so that little piece that I could add it there to over communicate was something I should have added in order to be able to communicate effectively. So when it comes to our relationships, and you mentioned that, I know we've kind of been talking about this, but I really want you to dive in real quick on what that over communication looks like in our relationships.
Yeah, we often play scripts in our head. So when I come to a conversation, even with, a business associate or someone I know from a mastermind like you or a friend, I come and start telling a story. And what I've learned over time is when I'm listening to people, really good storytellers and really good people that communicate are giving all the details necessary. They're not going into the stupid details, but they're giving the groundwork. And when we're married, and my wife and I've worked through this a lot. When we're married, we come to it thinking all the groundwork is laid because we live with them. Obviously, you know what's going on in my life. Obviously, you can read my mind that it's around the bowl, like the answer around the bowl. Like, why would you think any differently? We forget that a lot of the things, we're in our own world and we expect everyone else to live inside that world. So for my wife, she still does this. She'll just start talking to some time out. What is the point of reference here? You're talking about her. I don't know who her is. And so we're still working through that, 26 plus years married. But for me, asking a lot of questions is incredibly important in communication, almost probably more important than talking, hearing where someone is coming from. And so I tend to just over communicate. I do this with my boys. I'll lay a foundation. I try to be as quick as I can, so I'm not trying to like vomit everywhere, but hey, this situation, boom, boom, boom. And here's where we're at, boom, boom, boom. And so it seems redundant to us, but most frequently it's not redundant at all because we've been playing it in our own head. And I think that's just what we all need to understand is that we've been playing this own recording over and over in our head. And so we can leave out really important details because point A to Z is super easy to follow for us. For somebody, there has to be a B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. I mean, it has to go all the way through or they're totally lost. And this is I'm totally making up statistics. 98% of the statistics are made up on the spot anyway. So I would say at least 70% of our conversations, we're leaving out the bulk of the details that actually need to be taking place. And we just assume that our spouse knows it. And most frequently what happens is we're so used to each other. We're just kind of like in that yeah mode in our head. So if someone's telling your wife's saying something and you're like, yeah. Like I get it, but you have no clue. And then this communication, now we're off the rails and this grows further and further and further apart. So asking questions is incredibly important. Do you remember when we were talking about X, Y, and Z, or did I tell you about what's going on at work with Mary and Joe? Like, did I have that conversation with you? Because if I was asking myself, I'd say, yeah, I had that with my wife. We talked about that. She'd be like, no, or if we did, I don't remember. So we have to lay that foundation, that groundwork with our kids and our spouse. As redundant and crazy as it sounds, it is so foundational for effective communication.
Mm. Yeah, and it's so difficult to do that because you almost feel at the same time that you're talking down to somebody by trying to share that information that's just common knowledge for you. And that's what I find a lot of times for especially business owners, but even leaders or engineers, people that are in the weeds doing that work that they don't share as much because they think, well, everybody just knows that. It's common sense. But those
Yeah.
things that are common sense to you, those things that are no-brainers to you, are the things that people need to know about first before you can expand upon that idea.
And if given the opportunity, a way to get there is asking questions. And
Yeah.
we're not instinctually, I think, wired to ask questions. We're just instinctually wired to share and kind of mind vomit on
Mhm.
people. And slowing down to ask questions, most people will remember the conversations in which they're talking the most. And those will be the most impactful conversations they ever have. This is why when you're a guest on a podcast, like I get this way every time. You probably got this way too. You love those conversations because you're talking 75% of the time.
Yeah.
And so if you think of it from your spouse or your kids' mindset, I have a point I want to get across. How am I going to make them understand or be the most engaged? Is let them talk more than I even need to talk to get my
Mm.
point apart, because they're going to be like really invested in the conversation because you've really brought them in. And then that little bit that you share is actually going to stick. And so
Mm.
if you kind of look at it like how, you have two ears and one mouth for a reason. And that applies to when you're talking with your spouse and your kids. The less you talk and the more you listen, the further you're going to get in a situation.
Yeah, you are 100% correct there. So make sure that you are in your mind over communicating, which basically just means you're giving the details that you already know, and you need to speak with the other person as if they don't know that. You need to understand where they're at. They're not you. So over communicate that for sure and share those details that you have inside your head, and don't just draw a line over all the letters between A and Z. Go right through all of those letters. Sometimes it is literally every letter. Sometimes you can kind of skip a couple of letters as you
Oh
go
yeah.
along.
Yeah.
You'll see you got to be paying attention to the person you're speaking with as well, because their eyes are kind of glazed over. Either one, you're going too much into detail and now they're confused, or maybe you still aren't going into enough detail. But there's distinct little differences that you should be able to tell if you're paying attention to them as you're sharing that information.
Yeah. And we have to go back to the art of communication. One reason podcasts work really well is because typically the person who you're talking to is really paying attention and vice versa. And
Mm.
one reason why those conversations go so well. If I were sitting in a room with you right now and we were sitting at our little chair across from each other, we might get a ding on our phone. We actually pay attention to it. We have to get back to the art of really dialing into that person.
Mm.
And that is really incredibly important with your family. Really important. And so to the point where I realized my Apple Watch would ping and it would make me look at my watch, and I
Mhm.
immediately would shift. And so I have an Apple Watch because it tracks everything for me and I use it, but there are no notifications on it at all.
Yeah.
None, because it was just a constant like pulling me away from a conversation or something deep where I found like, oh my gosh, I have no clue what was going on. So there's this lost art of really dialing into somebody that is hard for me. Even though I preach this, it's really hard for me. And one of the reasons I preach it so much is because I am very intentional about being good at it and I still screw it up all the time. So it's the art of watching, it's the art of engagement, and it's the art of, you said, like paying attention to the social cues.
Mhm.
That's incredibly important. And you speed things up or slow them down or ask questions for to re-engage somebody when needed.
Yeah. And the question is not to say at the end of what your sentence you said, right? Or, don't say
Right.
those things. Those are bad ways to speak. but Scott, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed this conversation, really talking about relationships and communication. That to me is by far the most important communication that you could ever do. Forget speaking on stages, forget speaking in the boardrooms, forget speaking on a podcast. If you can't have that conversation in your relationship and have that effective communication, what's the point of life, really? Because you're going to be fairly miserable. And that doesn't have to be an intimate relationship. That's just any relationship you have. It's going to be tough to keep friendships or relationships if you can't communicate properly. But I want to go to our last question this evening. And I did not actually give you this warning, but I'm pretty sure you're going to have a pretty great answer for us. But if there was one message you could share for the rest of your life, what would that message be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I
Just one, and
really,
not one for every business you have, just one.
yeah, right. It's a tie, but for me, I believe, and I'm fumbling here. The truth is that I believe you will have a much better life if you have a foundation built on Christ. That is the
Mm,
truth, the very truth to the heart of me, because I believe that there is so much strength in having a foundation, moral boundaries, moral guidelines, an absolute truth, which I think is incredibly important to have absolute truths, and a guiding light, if you will, in how you operate with your family, how you operate in your business, how you operate as a friend, how you operate as a leader. That is incredibly important. And the other one is draw a circle around yourself and work on everything inside of that. So I had to put two in there. I'm sorry.
there you go. You're fine. Hey, but Christ is inside that circle. He's within
That's
you,
right.
right?
Yep. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, there you see. I'm tying it all together for you. Then, so I'll charge you later for
Thanks. I appreciate
that.
it.
But Scott, man, I appreciate you coming on and sharing all this value. If people want to follow you, get to know you more, where's the best place for them to do that?
Facebook, Scot Rammage, Rammage. And same with Instagram. And I also Brotherhood of Fatherhood on Instagram, which is where I really share my heart about parenting and marriage. Those are the places where I really talk about a lot, actually, Philip, a lot. I talk a lot about communicating with your kids on the Brotherhood of Fatherhood.
Love it. Well, definitely go check that out, everybody, because you're going to get so much more from that. What Scott is doing than what we just talked about in this episode. This was basically just a teaser there. But once again, Scott, thank you so much for coming on. And everybody else, make sure that you share this message, because without you, we can't continue to grow this message and have amazing guests on here that share their heart and share a story that needs to be shared so that you can learn to communicate more effectively.